January 1945. Cologne, Germany. The roar of engines fills the sky as a formation of Luftwaffe fighters zooms across the frozen landscape. Below the streets of Cologne are quiet, an eerie stillness that only a city under siege can create. The Luftwaffe pilots are confident, knowing they hold the advantage above. In the distance, a solitary P-51 Mustang emerges from the haze. The German pilots snicker, assuming their opponents are mere amateurs. This is routine. They've encountered similar targets before. But as the Mustang locks onto the tail of a Bf-109, a familiar arrogance shatters. The U.S. fighter closes in too fast, too precise. The German pilot pulls hard on the controls, trying to escape, but it's too late. A split second later, the Mustang's guns open fire. The German plane is engulfed in a ball of fire, spiraling down toward the ground. No evasive maneuver could save him. No warning. Just sudden, unrelenting destruction. The other pilots glance around in disbelief. Their confidence evaporates in the wake of a single kill. Minutes pass. Another engagement, another German aircraft faces the same fate. This isn't just a lucky shot. This is a new reality. This version respects the tone and pacing you requested, while keeping the action gripping and vivid with no labels or template-like phrases. By early 1945, Germany found itself cornered on multiple fronts. The Allies had pushed deep into German territory, and the once proud Luftwaffe had been battered into a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages, fewer trained pilots, and mounting losses from the relentless bombing campaigns had drained Germany's air force. The skies, once dominated by the Luftwaffe's fearsome fighters, were now contested every minute of the day. Germany still had the Tiger tank, an imposing symbol of their battlefield dominance. But even that war machine, with its thick armor and deadly 88mm cannon, could no longer shift the balance. The Allies were closing in, and the odds seemed to turn with every passing day. The Tiger was still a potent weapon, but it was a tool under siege, a symbol of a force that had lost its grip on the strategic initiative. The Americans, however, were in a different position. Despite mounting casualties and the strain of a war that had stretched them thin, they were gaining ground. For the U.S. forces, the goal wasn't just victory in the moment, it was the total collapse of Germany's ability to fight back. The U.S. military had adapted rapidly, integrating new technologies and tactics, most notably the P-51 Mustang, a fighter plane that had redefined the limits of air combat. With long-range capabilities and unmatched agility, it was the perfect counter to the German fighters that had once ruled the skies. But this wasn't just about air superiority. The U.S. was no longer fighting merely for survival. They were fighting to end the war, to sever the last threads of German resistance and force a complete surrender. The question was no longer if the Allies could win, it was how quickly they could dismantle the German war machine piece by piece. In the dark corners of German command, there were whispers. The Tigers, the ace pilots, the U-boats, these were their last tools, their final bargaining chips, but they were now losing one by one like pieces on a chessboard being swept off the table. For the U.S., the moment of reckoning had arrived. A decisive blow was needed. If they could not break through the last German strongholds, now the war would drag on, extending the suffering and extending the opportunity for Germany to regroup. The Americans had the power to end it, but only if they struck quickly before the Germans could adapt further. This was the moment when everything would shift, a door was opening, and it was about to swing wide. This version adheres to the guidelines, focusing on establishing context and stakes while maintaining a continuous cinematic flow. The language remains tense and focused on the immediate consequences of the battle, aligning with the overall theme of escalating intensity. By early 1945, Germany's grip on Europe was slipping. The Allies had carved through France and Belgium, and the Soviets were advancing relentlessly from the east. German forces were spread thin, their supply lines stretched to the breaking point. Despite all their previous successes, the once feared Wehrmacht was now struggling to hold back an unstoppable tide. In the skies above the Luftwaffe, once an emblem of German superiority was being decimated by the relentless Allied air campaign. But the Germans still had their heavy tanks. The Tiger, with its thick armor and devastating 88mm gun, was still considered the deadliest tank on the battlefield. It was a symbol of German might, an assurance to the troops that they could still turn the tide. The myth of the Tiger tank had been built up over the years, feeding into the belief that it was an unstoppable force, one that could withstand anything the Allies threw at it. On the other hand, the U.S. forces were pushing forward with growing confidence. Their heavy bombers pounded the German heartland from the skies, and their soldiers, though exhausted, were relentless. The Sherman tank had been a workhorse, though far less imposing than the Tiger. Yet the sheer numbers of Shermans on the battlefield, combined with their support from air superiority, began to tip the balance in favor of the Americans. The P-51 Mustang in particular became the game-changer. The long-range fighter could escort bombers deep into Germany's heart and return safely. Its speed, firepower, and maneuverability gave it an edge that the Luftwaffe could not match. The Mustang's presence in the sky was a constant reminder to the German pilots that they were losing control of the air. The once proud Luftwaffe pilots, known for their skills and bravado, were now forced to fight a battle they could not win. At the same time, German command was still holding on to the belief that their tanks and ace pilots could hold the line. There was a fatalistic hope that if they could just hold out long enough, the Allies would falter. They were wrong. For the Americans, the stakes were clear. They knew that if they didn't break through Germany's last line of defense, the war could drag on for months, if not longer. Every moment spent fighting in the trenches, every loss on the front lines meant more lives lost and more opportunities for Germany to regroup. The Americans understood the urgency. The sooner they broke Germany's remaining strength, the sooner the war would end. But this wasn't just about pushing forward. It was about crushing the myth that Germany could still threaten the world. The Tiger tank, the Luftwaffe's aces, the U-boats, all of these were symbols of fear of German invincibility. The Allies had to prove decisively that these symbols were nothing more than fragile myths. The P-51 Mustang, with its unrelenting presence in the sky, had already begun that process. But now it was time for the ground forces to finish the job. The Americans had what they needed to finish this war. The question now was whether they could strike hard enough to end it before the Germans could adapt. This moment wasn't just about one battle or one victory. It was the gateway to something much larger. The war wasn't over, but its outcome was beginning to feel inevitable. This passage adheres to the structure and tone you're looking for, focusing on the broader context and strategic stakes while ensuring there's no excessive explanation or deviation from the core narrative. The Tiger tank, known for its terrifying presence, was a symbol of German engineering. Armed with an 88mm cannon, it could fire a round capable of piercing nearly any tank's armor. Its thick, sloped armor made it nearly invulnerable to most Allied shells, and its commanding presence on the battlefield was unmatched. The Germans had long held the belief that no matter what the Allies brought to bear, the Tiger would hold its ground. It was the centerpiece of their counteroffensive strategies, the spearhead of their armored divisions, and the tool they believed would repel the Allied advance. However, while the Tiger was a force to be reckoned with at long distances, its true vulnerability lay in the confines of urban warfare. The heavy weight of the Tiger, nearly 60 tons, made it difficult to maneuver in tight spaces, and its turret, though powerful, was slower to rotate in the confines of streets or narrow alleys. At long range, the Tiger could dominate the battlefield, tearing through infantry and lighter vehicles with ease. But in close-quarters combat, it was far less effective. The U.S. had learned to exploit this weakness. The American Pershing tank was the solution to the German Tiger problem. Equipped with a 90mm gun, the Pershing's cannon could now challenge the Tiger head-to-head. Where the Tiger could outrange the Sherman, the Pershing was built to fight at the same distances and deliver a similar punch. Its armor, though thinner than the Tiger's, was designed to provide adequate protection without hindering mobility, something the Tiger's own bulk made difficult. In a direct firefight, the Pershing's firepower proved to be decisive. Unlike the Sherman's smaller 75mm gun, which could struggle against the thick armor of the Tiger, the Pershing's 90mm gun could reliably damage or destroy a Tiger from medium to short range. This wasn't just theoretical. The experiences of battlefield engagements would show that the Pershing was able to score direct hits that shattered the Tiger's reputation as an invulnerable fortress. On the battlefield, the Tigers were not only challenged by the Americans' superior numbers, but also by their tactics. The U.S. forces understood that while the Tiger could destroy tanks at range, it was vulnerable when caught off guard or when it had to fight at closer distances where maneuverability and speed became vital. The Germans had been used to dominating the battlefield with brute force, but the Pershing could hold its own against that force. But it wasn't just tanks that the Germans had to worry about. The Allies had built a formidable air superiority that Germany could not counter. The P-51 Mustang, with its long-range capabilities and superior dogfighting skills, was a constant threat. The Luftwaffe, once the undisputed master of the skies, had been rendered ineffective in many areas of the war by the sheer numbers and capability of American fighter planes. The P-51 was a precise, deadly weapon. It was fast enough to intercept bombers and defend them, but it was also capable of diving in on Luftwaffe fighters with unparalleled speed and accuracy. The Mustang's presence in the sky drastically altered the Luftwaffe's tactics. Pilots no longer had the freedom to roam the skies, engaging targets at will. The American fighters hunted them, and the Luftwaffe's once vaunted ace pilots, who had once been able to dominate the skies, were forced into defensive positions. The Mustang was no longer just a support fighter. It was a killer methodically taking down Luftwaffe aircraft, reducing their ability to contest the air war. The German pilots had no real counter. The best they could do was attempt to outfly the Americans, but the P-51's superior speed and range made that nearly impossible. And with Allied bombers being escorted so deep into German territory, the Luftwaffe was forced to fight a losing battle in the skies. Every successful engagement by an American pilot was not just a victory in the air, it was another nail in the coffin of the German war effort. Meanwhile, the U-boat, the pride of Germany's naval forces, was being hunted with an efficiency they had never experienced before. The Americans had adapted their tactics to counter the U-boats with sonar-equipped destroyers and corvettes hunting the silent predators of the sea. The Germans, once masters of underwater warfare, were now losing U-boats at an alarming rate. The Hedgehog, a new depth-charge weapon deployed by the Allies, made short work of U-boats, delivering a devastating pattern of charges that could guarantee a kill. The U-boats, which had once been capable of sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of merchant shipping, were now facing a relentless pursuit. The war beneath the waves, once a constant threat to Allied supply lines, was being turned against the Germans. The combination of improved sonar technology and new anti-submarine weapons meant that the Germans could no longer rely on their underwater fleet to disrupt the Allies' supply routes or inflict the same levels of damage as they once had. For the Germans, their ability to innovate and adapt had slowed considerably. The Allies were moving faster, learning from each engagement, and refining their tactics and technologies. The Americans had become a force that could take on the best Germany had to offer and come out victorious. The fact that the Pershing could take on the Tiger, the Mustang could engage the Luftwaffe, and the Hedgehog could destroy the U-boats wasn't a coincidence. The U.S. military was learning quickly, improving tactics, refining their weapons, and putting them into practice with remarkable speed. The myth of German invincibility was starting to crumble under the weight of American adaptation and innovation. What had once seemed impossible, the destruction of the Tiger, the defeat of the Luftwaffe, the destruction of the U-boats, was now a reality. This was no longer about which side had the better weapon. It was about who could adapt fastest, who could learn from their experiences, and who could turn the tide before the other side could recover. The Germans had once held the upper hand, but now it was the Americans who had seized it. The myth of German superiority was fading, replaced by the cold, hard truth of Allied progress. The battle lines were clear. The Germans were still fighting with outdated assumptions, while the Americans were rapidly evolving, reshaping the way war was fought. This section avoids templates and label-like phrases, maintaining a focus on the hard facts of the battlefield through a lived experience perspective, making the technical details feel tangible to the audience. The air in the cockpit was thick with the scent of burning fuel. The engine roared, a constant reminder that speed was life and anything less would lead to death. The air was sharp, biting through the fabric of the flight suit. The German pilot tightened his grip on the controls as his eyes scanned the sky, searching for the familiar shape of an American bomber. The mission had been the same for weeks: intercept, attack, and return. His focus was absolute. He had been doing this for years, and it had always been the same: a brutal, high-stakes game of survival. The Luftwaffe pilots, for all their skill, had been trained to expect certain patterns, certain movements. It was a game they knew well. He checked his fuel gauge, calculated the distance back to base, and adjusted his flight path accordingly. The enemy bombers were predictable, even if they were escorted by those infernal Mustangs. He had seen them before, powerful, fast, and deadly, but still just another threat to be dealt with. Then, out of the corner of his eye, A flash of movement caught his attention. He jerked his head to the left. There, in the distance, a single P-51 Mustang was weaving through the sky. It wasn't a bomber. It was a fighter, and it was heading straight for him. The German pilot's stomach twisted. He had heard the rumors, the whispers in the briefing rooms about the Mustang, a machine built for the job. It didn't just escort bombers. It hunted. The Mustang was relentless. He had heard that it could dive faster than anything in the sky and that its 50 caliber guns could tear through a fighter like paper. The Mustang wasn't afraid to fight, and it wasn't afraid to win. His hands moved automatically, positioning the aircraft into a dive, trying to escape the P-51's line of sight. He could hear the wind howl as the altimeter spun, the screech of metal and air pushing the aircraft faster. He was trained to maneuver, trained to get out of situations like this, but something felt off. The Mustang was already there, closing the gap faster than he had anticipated. This wasn't the way it was supposed to be. Through the glass, the American fighter grew larger and larger. His heart pounded in his chest. He knew he had to make a decision, a fast one. He needed to get behind the Mustang, get in position for the kill. He pulled the stick back, trying to climb into a better position. But the Mustang didn't follow the usual rules. The American plane wasn't afraid to break the pattern. The German pilot watched helpless as the Mustang's nose rose with him, maintaining the exact position needed to stay on his tail. It was like the American pilot knew what he was going to do before he did it. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. It was a cold, calculated response to every maneuver. The Mustang had the advantage, a tactical edge that the German pilot couldn't shake. He was losing ground, and he knew it. The Mustang didn't care about his dive. It didn't care that he had the sun at his back. The Mustang stayed locked in as if its pilot was waiting for him to make a mistake. The German pilot's hands shook. Sweat beaded on his brow. He didn't want to die here, not like this. His mind raced. Should he climb higher, try to turn harder, or break off and run for it? But the Mustang wasn't giving him that choice. It was already too close. Then, the inevitable happened. A burst of gunfire ripped through the air. The German pilot's aircraft bucked violently, a shock of pain tearing through the fuselage. The cockpit filled with smoke, and the controls became sluggish as the engine sputtered. He fought to regain control, but it was too late. The Mustang had struck, delivering a kill shot in a moment of sheer precision. As the ground rushed up to meet him, he felt his world collapse into a single, suffocating moment of terror. The world outside was spinning, the aircraft tumbling into a death spiral. He reached for the ejector lever instinctively, his mind now more concerned with escape than victory. The once proud Luftwaffe ace was no more than a man strapped to a failing machine plummeting to the earth. From the perspective of the American pilot, the experience was entirely different. He was calm, focused, the kind of calm that only comes with hours in the air, the kind of focus that turns every engagement into a game of pure mechanics. The Mustang's controls were an extension of his own body. He knew exactly what it could do, and more importantly, he knew exactly what it was capable of against the Luftwaffe's best. The P-51's nose was already locked onto the tail of the German plane as he smoothly squeezed the trigger. The burst of gunfire felt like second nature. The American pilot didn't flinch, didn't tense up, he knew what to expect. The German plane's engine sputtered and flames burst from the rear. It was a quick kill. It was routine, but the truth was, it wasn't easy. Every engagement brought its own level of danger. One wrong move, and it could be him in the German pilot's seat, spiraling toward the earth. But in that moment, it was clear. The Luftwaffe had no answer for this new reality. They couldn't outrun it, couldn't outfight it, and certainly couldn't outthink it. The Mustang was fast, sure, but more importantly, it was relentless. It was the kind of machine that didn't stop and didn't give up. And the German pilot had learned that the hard way. With the enemy aircraft now a blazing wreck below him, the American pilot didn't celebrate. There was no room for celebration. He kept his eyes on the sky, scanning for the next target, his mind already shifting to the next mission. That was the life of a fighter pilot, a constant fight, a constant push forward. There was no time for relief, no time for fear. It was kill or be killed. And today, it was the enemy who had fallen. This section focuses on the human experience within the cockpit, the psychological and sensory details that shape each pilot's decisions. It contrasts the two sides' reactions to the same event, highlighting the tension and emotional stakes of aerial combat without falling into melodrama. By 1945, the US military had adapted to the evolving battlefield with remarkable speed. They had not only refined their strategies, but also embraced new doctrines that emphasized rapid technological innovation and relentless pressure on Germany's fragile infrastructure. Every new weapon system, every tactical shift, was a direct response to the realities of a war that had stretched on far longer than anticipated. The Pershing tank was a product of this adaptation. The Sherman, while reliable and numerous, had proven inadequate in face-to-face combat with the German heavy tanks. Its 75 mm gun was insufficient against the Tiger's thick armor. The Pershing was developed to rectify that imbalance, a tank with a 90 mm gun capable of piercing the Tiger's hull and enough armor to withstand incoming fire. The decision to rush this heavy tank into production and deployment, despite its initial unrefinement, was a calculated risk. The U.S. military understood that the need to counter the German heavy tanks far outweighed the need for perfection. While the Pershing's entry onto the battlefield was met with a mix of trepidation and anticipation, it quickly proved its worth. The risk taken by the American leadership paid off, as the tank's effectiveness became clear in engagements against the Tiger and other German tanks. Unlike the Germans, who were hampered by limited resources and the need to conserve their precious few remaining Tiger tanks, the Americans were able to produce these new weapons in mass quantities, quickly replacing those lost on the RET battlefield. The assembly lines of American factories became an unstoppable engine of war, continually pumping out replacements, giving the U.S. forces a crucial advantage in terms of firepower and endurance. The same industrial capacity applied to the P-51 Mustang. The aircraft was engineered with one goal in mind: long-range escort for bombers. The challenge lay in providing an aircraft capable of escorting bombers deep into enemy territory with enough range to return safely without sacrificing firepower or speed. The Mustang was equipped with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that drastically improved its performance, allowing it to reach higher speeds and greater altitudes than the German fighters that had once ruled the skies. In tandem with its long-range capabilities, the Mustang's armament was devastating. 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns could unleash a hail of bullets powerful enough to tear through enemy aircraft. The decision to mass-produce the P-51 Mustang was another bold move by American high command. The aircraft wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. With the Luftwaffe losing fighters at an alarming rate and the production of new aircraft failing to keep pace, the Mustang represented a crucial turning point. It wasn't just that the U.S. had better planes. It was that they had the ability to keep producing them in larger numbers and deploying them faster than the Germans could handle. The sheer scale of American production meant that no matter how many Mustangs were shot down, more were on the way. The logistics behind this war-winning momentum were equally crucial. The U.S. military's ability to supply vast quantities of material was a direct result of its industrial might. The Red Ball Express, for instance, was a supply line that kept the advancing Allied armies fueled and equipped, ensuring that no matter how hard the Germans tried to disrupt the advance, the Allies could continue to push forward. The Germans, in contrast, were operating with a dwindling supply of fuel, ammunition, and fresh troops. Their factories, once the heart of the war effort, were being bombed relentlessly, and their supply lines were stretched thin by the multiple fronts they had to maintain. By contrast, the American logistics network was agile and adaptable. The U.S. could rapidly shift production priorities quickly, replacing destroyed tanks, aircraft, and trucks. This flexibility allowed the U.S. to maintain momentum while the Germans were bogged down in supply crises that crippled their ability to mount an effective defense. The key to understanding the American advantage lay in their flexibility, not just in terms of tactics, but in their willingness to innovate at all levels of warfare. The German military, though formidable, was burdened by a rigid command structure and a reliance on outdated strategies. Even when confronted with the realities of war, the German leadership was reluctant to abandon their most iconic systems, such as the Tiger tank. The result was a German military that struggled to adapt, clinging to its old ways even as the Allies innovated and overwhelmed them. As the Americans continued to churn out tanks, aircraft, and supplies, their strategic advantage became clearer. They were no longer relying on a handful of elite units or exceptional individuals. They were fighting with the strength of an entire industrial machine, one that could replace what was lost, improve upon what was learned, and strike again and again without pause. In this war of attrition, it was the American war machine that would outlast the German effort. This industrial backbone allowed the U.S. to continue adapting to the battlefield's needs, ensuring that no matter the losses, no matter the setbacks, their capacity to fight, to innovate, and to sustain was unmatched. It was an advantage the Germans simply could not match, and it would prove to be one of the decisive factors in the eventual collapse of Nazi Germany. This section focuses on the importance of American industrial production, the flexibility in their strategic decision-making, and the rapid adaptation of new weapon systems, illustrating how the U.S. outpaced the Germans in terms of resources and logistical support. The battlefield had shifted in ways the Germans had never expected. The Tiger, once regarded as the invincible fortress on wheels, was no longer the feared weapon it had been just months earlier. What had once been an impenetrable juggernaut capable of slaughtering enemy tanks and infantry with ease had become a target one that the Americans now hunted with a ruthless efficiency. The battle at Cologne, where the Pershing tank had made its debut, was not just a defeat in a single engagement. It was a symbolic collapse of the myth surrounding the Tiger. The German tank crews, who had once been proud of their seemingly unbeatable machines, now found themselves in a new reality. They had believed that the Tiger's armor and firepower could handle anything the Allies could throw at it. But as American tanks with their 90mm guns began to breach the once impregnable armor, that belief began to disintegrate. The first Tiger was destroyed not by a lucky shot, but by a series of calculated moves, the precise, methodical tactics that the Americans had honed over months of combat. What was more devastating for the Germans was the realization that they could not replace the Tigers fast enough. While the Allies were able to pump out new tanks, aircraft, and supplies from their factories, the Germans were struggling to keep their war machine running. The myth of the invincible Tiger fell apart as more and more of them were destroyed in the field. Each loss was not just a blow to the German military, but a blow to their morale, a shattering of their faith in the one weapon they had relied on to win the war. For the German soldiers, it was a bitter pill to swallow. The myth of the Tiger tank had been built up over years, perpetuated by Nazi propaganda and the successes of the early war. It had become a symbol of German superiority, of their ability to fight and win against overwhelming odds. But now, faced with the unrelenting pressure from American forces, that myth was exposed as hollow. The Luftwaffe had once held the skies in a vice grip, terrorizing Allied bombers and keeping the skies clear of enemy fighters. But the arrival of the P-51 Mustang had upended that reality. The Mustang was fast, versatile, and deadly, and it shattered the illusion of Luftwaffe dominance. The German pilots, once regarded as the best in the world, found themselves unable to compete against the relentless wave of American fighters. The skies above were no longer the domain of the Luftwaffe. They were contested, and increasingly, they were lost. At first, the Luftwaffe pilots tried to adapt. They attempted to change their tactics to outmaneuver the Americans, but the Mustangs had already proven their superiority. The speed of the P-51, its ability to chase down and destroy the best German fighters, made it impossible for the Luftwaffe to regain control. The once proud German aces, whose names had been whispered in awe, were now being hunted by American pilots, who had grown accustomed to the Mustang's deadly dance in the sky. It was clear that the balance had tipped. The Germans, despite their legendary tanks and skilled pilots, were losing the war not because of one single weapon or one single battle, but because of their inability to adapt. Their reliance on outdated strategies and technologies, their inability to replace their losses with the same efficiency as the Allies had doomed them. The myths they had built around their machines, their tanks, and their pilots had been shattered by an enemy that adapted quickly, that outproduced them, and that fought with relentless determination. In the midst of the chaos, the collapse of the German myth was both tactical and psychological. As each Tiger tank was destroyed, as each German plane fell from the sky, the reality set in their once great war machine was no longer the terror it had been. The invincible forces that had been portrayed as the backbone of the Nazi war effort were now on the defensive, no longer able to intimidate or dominate. The end of this myth was not just about losing battles or tanks. It was about the unraveling of the German psyche. The morale of their soldiers began to falter as they realized that the very weapons they had been told would guarantee victory were failing. The belief that Germany could win, that they could turn the tide, was now being replaced by a more terrifying realization they were losing, and no amount of myth-making or propaganda could change that. The final blow to the German myth came in the form of the Allies' relentless offensive. The Allies were not just defeating the German military, they were dismantling the ideological foundation upon which it had been built. The tanks, the planes, the soldiers, they were all part of a mythic narrative that was now crumbling under the weight of the Allies' superiority. For the Germans, the moment of realization came too late. The myth had collapsed, and with it any hope of victory. The Americans had shown that superior numbers, better technology, and the ability to adapt could break even the most fearsome military machine. And in that collapse, the Germans were left with nothing but the cold truth they had lost. This section focuses on the gradual destruction of the German war machine's mythic status, paralleling the fall of the Tiger tank and Luftwaffe with the psychological and strategic collapse that followed. The once legendary weapons and soldiers were revealed to be vulnerable, and this realization was key to the German defeat. The immediate aftermath of the battle was not just a military victory, but a psychological turning point for both sides. For the Americans, the destruction of the Tiger tank and the dominance of the Mustang over the Luftwaffe were not just tactical achievements, they were symbols of the inevitable collapse of Germany's once formidable war machine. The Allies had broken the myths that had fueled German morale, and now with each victory they tightened their grip on the European theater. In the weeks and months following these battles, the reality of American industrial might and military innovation began to fully set in. The U.S. forces armed with superior numbers and an unrelenting supply of fresh tanks, planes, and soldiers pressed their advantage. The Germans, meanwhile, were faced with the grim truth. Their ability to replace lost units was gone, their factories crippled by bombing raids, and their soldiers exhausted from years of warfare. Their defensive efforts became increasingly desperate, but they were never enough to stem the tide of Allied advancement. But while the immediate effects were devastating for the Germans, the longer-term legacy of this shift was even more significant. The collapse of the German war effort in the spring of 1945 left behind a generation of soldiers who had been forced to reckon with the reality that the technological and psychological advantages they had once believed in no longer existed. The Tiger tank, once a symbol of German superiority, was now a relic of the past, a reminder of how quickly myths could crumble in the face of relentless innovation. For the Allies, this victory was more than just a blow to German power. It was a statement about the nature of modern warfare. It wasn't about having the best weapon. It was about having the capacity to outproduce, outmaneuver, and outlast the enemy. The American ability to adapt, to learn from each engagement, and refine their tactics was now the template for the future of warfare. The myth of invincible technology was shattered, replaced by the cold, hard truth: superior numbers, faster adaptation, and the power of industrial production could overcome even the most entrenched enemy defenses. As the war drew to a close, the world would come to understand the true cost of this victory. The remnants of the German military, once a force that had shaken the world, were now scattered and broken, their symbols of power reduced to scrap metal. But the questions raised by this shift about the nature of military power, the role of myth in warfare, and the power of innovation would linger long after the war ended. What if the Germans had adapted faster? What if the Tiger had been produced in greater numbers, or if they had found a way to counter the Mustang's dominance in the skies? Could the outcome have been different? These questions would continue to spark debates among historians and military theorists for decades to come. As the Allies moved forward, the lessons learned from the collapse of the German military would shape future conflicts. The ability to outproduce and out-innovate the enemy, to adapt to rapidly changing battlefield conditions, would be the hallmark of modern warfare. The myth of invincible technology, whether it was the Tiger tank, the U-boat, or the Luftwaffe, would no longer hold sway. Instead, the focus would shift to the adaptability of the forces that fought in the trenches, in the air, and at sea. In the next episode, we turn our attention to another German legend, the Panther tank. Regarded as the pinnacle of German tank design, the Panther was seen by many as the perfect medium tank. But what happens when it faces the U.S. Sherman, a tank that had been underestimated for so long? What will the clash of these two armored giants reveal about the true nature of battlefield supremacy? This section focuses on the long-term consequences of the events and explores the questions raised by the destruction of the German war machine. It sets up a transition to the next episode while emphasizing the broader implications of the collapse of myths in warfare and the lessons learned for the future.